My late wife Samantha had just given birth to her third child, and her labor was exhausting, so she stayed home a few days to recover from the birth. After a week or so, she decided to take the baby to visit her mother, which was 20 minutes away, through a rural area. To get there and back, she had to take a rural 2-lane blacktop road called Riddle Road in Jefferson County, Illinois. She decided to start heading home around 3 p.m. as to make it home before dark. And as she was driving along, she seen what she thought to be a tall man standing next to the road, and she started to slow down, just in case the man stepped into the road. As she got closer, she soon realized that it wasn't a man at all, but a tall creature covered with jet black fur. This shocked her, and as she came upon the creature, she slowed her car down almost to a stop, thinking it was someone wearing a really well-made Halloween costume, since it was mid-October. But immediately, it was clear that it was not a costume at all. She said the creature was around 7 feet tall with jet black fur and yellowish golden eyes, and standing on dog type 2 legs. She went on to say it was like a bodybuilder, and she could see its extremely muscled body through the thinner areas of fur. She said that it had hands with long fingers instead of paws. She stopped within 20 feet of this creature due to the pure shock of seeing it there standing next to the road. She could see its breath in the cold air, and its fur was moving with the wind, and it, without a doubt, was a living, breathing animal. She and it just stared at each other for what she said felt like 20 minutes, but was more likely less than a minute or two. Finally, she said it smiled. Yes, it smiled at her, and that was more than she could handle, and she pushed the pedal to the metal, as they say. She looked in her rearview mirror, and as she drove away, she said that it walked on across the road and into a cornfield on the opposite side. And yes, it walked on 2 legs. I know the story sounds fake, and it doesn't matter if anyone believes it. But if you knew her and heard her tell you the exact same story over and over again without any changes to it, you would probably think twice about taking Riddle Road alone. This happened to me back when I was just a little boy, back in the early 1980s. Quick info about me. At the time of this happening, I was living at my grandmother's house with my grandmother, due to my parents having a volatile relationship, and it wasn't safe for me to be there. That's a whole other nightmare, but I'll focus on this one today. Because she really didn't have a spare room, per se, I would sleep out in the living room on her big couch. Facing the couch across the living room is a little reading nook area with 3 big windows that were all angled. Laying on the couch, I could look over to my right and look directly out the windows that were maybe 20 feet away. Anyway, one night I was lying asleep when I felt awakened by something. For some reason, I thought to turn to my right, like my instincts were screaming danger. I looked to my right, and there was this extremely tall gray figure with glowing red eyes staring at me through the nook area. I remember screaming as loud as I could, and my grandmother about burst down the stairs in frantic and in a total panic. I was hysterical and told her what I had just seen. She chalked it up to being a bad nightmare and just pinned a blanket over the windows. I don't know how much longer it continued to watch me, but after I started screaming, and by the time my grandmother got downstairs, it was gone. For the next 3 months, I would stay there. I would always pin the blanket back up over that nook window once it got dark. I couldn't sleep unless it was up. I always felt like in the back of my mind it was watching me through the blanket still, wanting me to come outside. I'm getting goosebumps just remembering it and it scared me so bad. I don't exactly remember where my grandmother lived because she passed away shortly after I turned 13, but I do remember that she lived way west of New York State. In fact, I think she wasn't too far from Pennsylvania to be exact, but I can't exactly remember how far. Date 2015. Location Wise River, Montana. Weather humid, summer night, around 11:30 p.m. I lived alone, and in this remote location, we don't have cable, so the only option is satellite TV. It was a humid summer night in July, and the TV was acting up again, so I needed to go out and readjust the satellite like usual. I took a flashlight and a gun with me. When I went outside, it was unusually quiet. I also had purchased an AR due to other sightings I've had, but they weren't credible enough to chalk it up as a dogman. Like, so silent it was unnerving. I brushed the thought off and went to the dish, which is in the corner of my yard. I went to work, making sure all the wires were all right and pointing to it a different angle. Suddenly, I hear a small snap of a stick to my left and turn the flashlight to the direction, and I saw a creature standing there. I got a good look at for what seemed like an eternity, but was for only about 10 seconds. I slowly backed off and ran back to the house and locked all my doors and windows. This creature was unlike anything I have ever seen before. When I shined light at it, the first thing I noticed was the head. It had cropped ears that pointed upwards. Its snout was more narrow than a bear and longer, and I could make out large teeth protruding from the jaw. Its eyes were a deep red shade that seemed to reflect off the light I was pointing at. The body was muscular and huge. It had long arms that appeared to be longer than its legs, broad shoulders that tapered into a skinnier waist. It was slightly crouched over when I saw it, with one hand wrapped around a small tree. I could make out the legs, which looked similar to a dog's legs. It had obvious hocks. Even the crouched position, it was about my height, which is 6 foot. Standing up to full height, this creature could have easily been 7.5 to 8 feet tall. The fur was so black and thicker on the neck and chest, and the bottom half significantly less so. I don't know if it was aggressive or not. What I know is I had a feeling of dread unlike anything I've experienced. Was it just observing me or stalking me? For a creature this large, it was deceivingly silent. It got within 15 yards of me without me noticing. All I knew was I needed to get out of there and not find out. I don't live on the property anymore, but after the event, I never had another face-to-face encounter. But I would hear sounds in the woods I could not explain. They would usually start off relatively quiet and work their way up to furious screams and then back down to quiet again. I don't know if this was the same thing because it could be local wildlife. The location this encounter took place is 61720 Montana Highway 43 Wise River, in case you want to search up the location on Google Maps. I have a short story to share with you. My dad was recently chased out of the woods by what he describes as the largest wolf he's ever seen in his life. I'm really into paranormal and cryptids, so when he told me about this, I was heavily intrigued and pushed for answers. He doesn't like talking about it because it really scared him. I'm not sure what he saw out there, but whatever it was really spooked him. And my dad isn't one to be scared easily. He's been through a lot in life: prison, knife fights, gangbanging, drug dealing. He's been face to face with death, and he told me he's never felt fear like he did when this thing charged him. The best way he could explain it to me was a big black dog with a hunched back, overly sharp teeth, and too many teeth for its mouth to be exact, and piercing eyes charged at him as he approached the carcass of a 3-point buck that was virtually left unscathed on the ground. He said as he approached the carcass, he began to hear noise to his left, and out of the clearing, this dog just started running him down. He said he's never, ever had his fight or flight senses hit him so heavily at once. So, he ran. He believes it only to be a bluff charge and made him run his 3/4 of a mile back to his truck. What my dad doesn't understand is why would there be a dead buck in a clearing like that? It wasn't being eaten on, it was just lying there like it was freshly killed somehow. Why did this dog chase him away? Was it planning on eating it? Sorry this is short, I just thought I'd like to share this with you. Howdy everybody. My family has a fairly strange relationship with the dogmen in the southeastern region of the United States. I've always lived around MD, but my family originally started off in Louisiana. My family were, as my grandpa put it, Carney Entrepreneurs. Best way I can put his accent into text. Anyway, our family arrived from Cuba and started our little carnival act, which I'm happy to say isn't still in action, around 1898. They would travel throughout the South, performing and doing work on defunct plantations and farms. During this time, my well, you get the point, grandfather came into contact with a local Native American tribe. He never really talked about it, but shortly after my family started having contact with dogmen. My grandfather, back when they were still traveling with the carnival, talked about seeing the beast walking around their camps at night. He has a bunch of stories that I might talk about later, but he suffers from dementia pretty heavily, so you'll have to take them with a grain of salt. My dad worked for a while in the telephone industry, putting up poles. He was up doing maintenance one night on Gambrel Mountain. As he was driving back down the mountain, he saw about 3 dogmen running alongside his truck and staring at him through his windows. My experiences are a bit more involved. I've been hunting in the mountains around where I live for quite a while now, and every time I head out I see one of them. Typically, they're just off in the distance, or just walking around the riverbanks fetching water. I wanted to know if anybody else has any sort of explanation as to maybe why they seem to be following my family around. I was out setting up a deer stand a couple years back. Had to hike in and find the perfect tree for it. Made sure I had a lot of clearing and such. I saw something across the mini canyon by me that I just can't explain. It was a tall, upright figure, all black but appeared to have a snout and perky ears. I don't know what I was looking at. Whatever it was watching me through the trees at first, and then I noticed that it was looking at me. It continued to stare me down, and then somehow seemingly disappeared into the brush. It was strange. I've never seen an animal that looked anything like that before. I wrote it off at first as just a big black bear watching me, but it didn't look right. It was much more skinny and looked more dog than bear. I went back to that area and hunted for the season and had no issues again, but sometimes I wonder if there's any animals that have never been discovered here in Oklahoma. This happened when I was much younger. I'd have to ask my parents when the camping trip happened just to tell you how many years ago it was, but I could assure you it was at least a decade. Now I'm going to use some questionable words for describing the location. Words like wooded and wilderness reserve, because I don't know the best words for these things. Around a decade ago, a friend from church asked me to join his family on a camping trip to a wilderness reserve called Oasis State Park. Of course, since this was my best friend and his family, and they had always been nice, I said yes. Up until that point, I had only camped rarely, so the prospect of camping with a friend and his family seemed absolutely amazing. So we began preparing for a weekend when I wasn't busy. I got my own tent, my own sleeping bag, and all my own supplies. Once all that was gathered, the father of the friend came and picked me up, and my parents waved me off. There are quite a few things I remember from that trip. The amazing hostile yet beautiful New Mexico countryside, the plateaus, and the campsite. The New Mexican wilderness isn't something a lot of people fantasize about camping in, at least not so far as I know. But Oasis State Park is different. The camping plots are all nice, even if the best are always taken. There's a pretty lake, lots of wildlife, and I hate to admit, more trees than I have ever seen in town. Yeah, I know nobody thinks of multitude of trees when they think of New Mexico, and for good reason. They aren't the most common occurrence in the plains unless planted by people. Regardless, Oasis has enough for me to just use the term woods, for the sake of brevity. So, anyway, we found ourselves a plot and began setting up our tents. By afternoon, the tents were set, and me and my friend ditched his oh, so boring, younger sister in favor of exploring the park. The memories are fantastic. We found a snake by the lake and watched it drink from the water before slithering off quickly. We explored a place I remember was very sandy. We watched a roadrunner doing its thing. We played all day after lunch and saw so many amazing things that by the end of the day, I never would have thought anything could have gone wrong. We finished the day like we always did, by collecting sticks and starting a fire to eat s'mores and whatnot, and of course, tell ghost stories. None of the stories were scary, probably because me and my friend were kids, and his sister was even younger, and his father was the lead singer at our church. Making the children cry was bad for reputation. So, by ghost stories, I mean little jokes of stories designed to make us giggle more than cry. Yeah, it was lame, but I mean, what do you expect? Anyway, shortly after the stories were said and s'mores were eaten, we retired. Me to my tent, and my friend, his father, and his current sister to their tent. Now, for this setup, I'll explain further positioning. This is all going to be important. My tent was at one edge of the plot, and my friend's tent was at the exact opposite. This was for privacy reasons. Now at my end of the plot was a mini trail that led through thick brush to the lake. Also, about 3 feet from my tent was a little tree. I don't know what kind of tree it was, but it was still young and small. The trail to the lake was to the left of my tent entrance, and the lake was behind it, and a thin tree line sat across the trail in front of my tent. That trail in front of my tent led to the bathrooms. So, I went to bed without a single bit of fear, and before I did, I went ahead and urinated on the tree outside my tent just because of laziness. Screw the 2-minute walk to the bathrooms when nature's toilet was outside. So, I finished closing up my tent for the night and climbed into my sleeping bag, just ready to go to bed. I don't know how long I slept, but when I woke up I had to use the bathroom, and it wasn't the kind of potting I could do on a tree, or at least not reasonably. So I, not being a moron who'd wander through the dark, grabbed my little lantern. I flipped on my LED lantern and I unzipped the inner flap of my tent before the outer, as if that little nylon net could protect me from what I was about to see. Now, I should mention to you that outside of the cities in New Mexico, it's quite common to hear coyote howls. It's a nightly occurrence when camping, actually. Heck, even up in a little village like Logan, you can hear the howls from your bedroom. It isn't so unnerving when you're in a house, but when you got some flimsy nylon walls to protect you and that's it, well, it isn't the most comforting sound. As I unzipped my tent flap, I did hear a few howls, but they were distant and not worrying. What stunned me into stillness was a very loud howl from the direction of the lake, about a yard from my tent at most. This howl was different though. It had the feel of a coyote howl, but it was deeper, and it lasted longer. I simply sat there, petrified at what I had heard. I wouldn't be able to guess at how long I sat there, breathing hard with my fingers still grasping at the zipper. But however long it may have been was just long enough for the thing that made the howl to come up the trail next to my tent. Suddenly, I heard the crunching of claws on dirt, and after that, claws on the rocks that made our camping plots. Then I saw the largest shadow made by a living creature that little kid me had ever seen. It lumbered heavily in the direction of the sparse tree line where I assumed the other howling had come from. But before it got past the tree I urinated on, it stopped. I realized only then that I was both lit like a candle and had not been trying to silence my heaving breathing. By then it was too late, as that hulking thing lumbered over closer to the tree and into the light of my lantern. As dim as the little LED light was at that distance, it was just barely enough to make out details. I'd like to note a very few important details that stuck out to me as odd. It had roughly the fur coloring of a coyote, but that classic dogman head shape with the tiny pointed ears too small to make sense. It also made strange noises as it lowered to all fours in front of my tent. Popping sounds like joints rubbing together, as I can only assume its knees busted out of their standing joints and fell into different joints to support all fours. It briefly ignored the very obviously frightened kid, me, in my tent, as it sniffed the tree I had urinated on earlier. The breasts were similar to a dog's, but longer and far deeper, almost like a horse's. Then, that thing turned to me and stared straight into my eyes. Its eyes didn't glow. They didn't peer into my soul, but they were unbelievably unnatural. Above all the things I saw in those eyes, I saw a predator. Have you ever been in a position where you made eye contact with a beast you know is stronger than you? Something you know could just slaughter you, and you know it knows that you know. Just looking for seemingly so damn long that I thought for sure I'd just be a bloody stain by the time anyone reached my tent. Screaming would get me nowhere. I doubted a gun would even hurt this thing. But despite every feeling in my gut, despite the dread of knowing it was a predator and I was prey, I didn't die. Instead it turned, slowly, ever so slowly, and just sprinted off into the woods. Just gone into the night faster than it came. I have one personal friend who knows, and he jokes that made it was my piss on that tree. Like I marked my territory or something dumb like that. Or maybe it just wasn't hungry. Or, most improbable, it had just enough morals to not kill a kid. I'll never really know. Needless to say, I don't go to the bathroom. I just put my lantern away, closed my tent flap, and held it in all night. I don't remember sleeping that night. I might have, I might not. But if I did, it was dreamless. I do remember that I tried to hide this experience the next day, asking if my friend and his family heard any howling. While they did hear the howling, they told me they just ignored it, thinking it was a coyote doing coyote stuff. I was encouraged to just ignore it as if I was a city kid who had never heard a coyote howling before. The next day, I stayed as close to my friend as possible while exploring and had nearly forgotten the encounter by lunch. Somehow, the safety I had been feeling during the day put the beast out of my mind, until we found tracks in that super sandy place. Coyote tracks. I think seeing those tracks confirmed to me that it wasn't just some dream. And because of that, I showed enough fear that night to convince my friend's family to let me sleep in their tent. Even in the comfort of a warmer tent, and in the presence of an adult and 2 other people, I still couldn't sleep that night. I'd nearly drift into sleep and then I'd hear a howl. The next day I pretended to be sick and got my mother to drive up and take me home a day or 2 early. Worst camping trip of my life. It ruined not only my whole summer, but ruined camping. I haven't been camping without a buddy since, and I don't plan to. Even then I'm never comfortable, always listening for strange noises and acting paranoid. This really fucked me up, I guess. Being forced to see that human, top of the food chain, is utterly powerless in front of such a beast. Seriously, I don't think I can press hard enough to make everyone realize how powerless I felt. Even today when I think about this, I remember 2 things first. Those eyes and that feeling. Just writing this sent multiple shivers up my spine. So, my man and I shared an apartment for a while and it seemed pretty normal. After a while, things became hectic in the relationship and I moved out and we were broken up for about 9 months or so before I moved back in and worked things out. During my time away, he told me he had 2 friends of his move in and stay temporarily. Cool. Here is where it gets weird. Once I moved back in, the comfort in the apartment wasn't the same. I felt like I was being watched. Walking past the bathroom was highly uncomfortable, and I swore I would see shadows dancing in the hall while I sat in the living room. I would shut the bedroom doors to both bedrooms, thinking that maybe it was the light from outside reflecting the shadows of the trees into the hall. But no, sir. It continued. I brushed it off for a while and thought my imagination had gotten the best of me, until one night. We were in our bedroom, and I was sitting on the edge of the bed. I looked over his shoulder, and in the hall, I saw a pitch-black shadow of a child run from the front of the apartment into the bedroom down the hall. I shot up and went to the bedroom, and what do you know? No one there. I told him about it, and he simply said it was my imagination. He doesn't believe of things in the paranormal nature. A few days later, his daughter was dropped off. She played in the other bedroom. She got quiet and then came into the living room where we sat and proceeded to ask him, "Daddy, whose baby was that in the hallway?" At this point, I was kind of happy but confused. Happy because I wasn't the only one. Confused because I saw a child, not a baby. Yet, once again, he ignored it and said it was just us. But then, we often sat together in the living room, watching movies. One day we heard noises, and I told him there was something wrong. Something was in the apartment. And to my satisfaction, he experienced it. He saw a man, also a dark shadow, just like the baby and child. The door to his daughter's room opened, and then it closed. She was not there this time. She was with her mother. The door handle jiggled until he got to the door, and then it stopped. This shadow would peek around corners, stand in the hall and watch us, and just frightened the hell out of me. He apologized for not believing, and he was a lifelong skeptic that had been proven wrong. He told his friend that he had lived there for some time before I moved back. His friend casually said, "Oh, things like that follow me around and have since childhood. I guess I left one behind." I became angry. I think some things should be shared with someone when you move into their home, you know? I snore, I sleepwalk. Casper is my first cousin and we're pretty close. Those kinds of things. We moved, but I'm still confused. Like, was it a baby, child, or a man? Did it appear to us in different forms? Was it actually 3 and not 1? But in our new place, we get the feeling we haven't moved here alone. So is it now attached to us? I still have so many questions. Hey everyone. About 2 weeks ago, I had a really scary experience, and my husband doesn't believe me. But last night, he had a very similar experience, and now we're both wondering what we could have possibly seen. Our puppy was barking to go outside to use the bathroom. It was about 4 or 5 in the morning. I took him out back and stood on the steps of our deck because I didn't want to get my feet wet. My dog was using the bathroom when I looked up and saw something across the yard. It was slowly walking toward me, like one step at a time, and its eyes were super reflective of my phone's flashlight. I thought it was a deer, but its eyes were so tall and staring straight at me. It wasn't running away, but walking closer. I hurried the dog up, and we ran inside. I have reoccurring night terrors, so at first, my husband thought it was just that. But I was crying and shaking and could barely talk about it. He told me it was probably a deer, but I just wasn't convinced. I refused to take the dog out after midnight, though. Early this morning, about 5 in the morning, the dog was barking and he took him outside. Once again, my husband stood on the deck stairs. He didn't have his glasses, but he said when he looked up, he saw something tall standing in the forest part of our backyard. He said he saw it walking slowly, like it was almost gliding. He said as soon as he noticed it, he got a nosebleed. My husband is typically prone to nosebleeds, but hasn't had one since the season has changed. He said he wanted to get a closer look, but felt like he needed to go inside instead, like instinctually. So he ran in. My husband also happens to be a zookeeper, and he isn't really afraid of animals. He works with giraffes and elephants, and says this creature was definitely bigger than any deer. We've been trying to search what else it could be, but are coming up with nothing. Any ideas? Oh, and for reference, we live in eastern Pennsylvania. If you need to be more specific or take a picture of my yard for reference, just let me know. This happened 3 years ago, during mid-July. I lived in Montana, outside of a rural community with a population of about 2,000. During this time, I lived in a small one-floor ranch home by myself. My nearest neighbor lived 1 mile away and was a farmer. I never had many strange encounters leading up to this one, but the woods by my house had always an ominous feel to them. Soon after moving in, I realized why the previous homeowners left pretty quickly. I'd start to hear noises in the woods. These weren't just any noises, but what sounded like blood-curdling screams and growls. After doing some research, I learned that even something like a raccoon or bobcat can make these unnatural noises, and chalked it up to being that. But still, it just never felt right, you know? It's hard to explain. But I never felt like this before, and it was just something about the woods around my house that made me uncomfortable. Like I was always being watched. The first experience, I couldn't explain what happened, but it happened about 2 weeks after I moved in. There was a thunderstorm, and the thunder was loud enough to keep me awake. The lightning was crazy and would light up the whole surrounding area for just a fraction of a second. I was lying on the couch and got up to get a glass and drink at the sink. It was about 2 a.m. if I recall correctly. Above it, there's a small window that gives a view of my yard leading up to the tree line. When the next flash of lightning hit, I saw it. Admittedly, it wasn't a long view, but it gave me enough time to see whatever this thing was. It was near the tree line, just a few steps into my yard. First thought was that it was a bear, but it wasn't. It was standing on 2 legs with its face pointed towards the house. Its legs were haunched like a dog's, and I could clearly make out the hocks. It was hard to tell the color of the fur, but it was dark. Its upper body was massive, with a wide torso and arms that could almost reach the ground from standing. The strange thing is how the upper body seemed to dwarf the lower body. After standing there, frozen in shock, I waited for the next lightning strike. But when it happened, it wasn't there. It happened so quickly and was gone so quickly. After that, I bought a gun and would sleep with it within arm's reach. The next encounter is what I consider the most frightening thing of my life. For several weeks, nothing worth noting happened. I don't get cable where I live, and one night I was watching something and my satellite kept acting up. I didn't like going outside at night, but this would be quick. I just had to move the antenna a little bit. Nothing had happened for a few weeks, so I decided to just go out and do it. I grabbed my gun and flashlight and went out. The first thing I noticed was the eerie quietness that surrounded me. This time of year at night, the woods are active with all types of creatures. Not tonight, though. Despite the fear I was developing, I made my way over to the satellite and began to adjust it. I heard a small snap of a stick and quickly turned to my left and shined the light towards the direction of the noise. What I saw will horrify me for the rest of my life. I was immediately met with red eyes. These eyes were color of blood, and they were evil. The head of this thing looked like a mutated German Shepherd. I don't like to say it, but it looked like a werewolf. A long snout and pointed ears. The fur was black and shaggy in some places. I could see this creature's extremely developed muscles, and it dwarfed even the biggest humans on Earth. It was half in and half out of the woods, almost crouching, and it still came up to my head at 6 feet. Fully standing, this thing would have been 8 feet, I estimated. I was about 20 feet from this thing. I didn't even consider my gun, which I thought to protect me. Chances are, in hindsight, the little .223 bullets would have just pissed this thing off before it tore me to shreds. I backed away slowly, never breaking eye contact with it. I gently picked up my gun, and my fight or flight reflexes kicked in. I chose flight. Maybe not the best option, but even if I stayed there, this thing would have killed me. I ran the fastest I have ever in my life and didn't turn back once. I have no idea if it was pursuing me. I got in the house though, and I locked every door, window, and covered the blinds and sat with my back against the wall, cradling the gun the entire night. I didn't get a wink of sleep that night, and very few the following days to come. To make a long story short, I don't live there anymore. People often talk about Sasquatch being harmonious with nature and living within the ecosystem. Sure, if you see one, it might seem scary, but it's probably more awe than anything. With this thing, though, it was totally different. It felt unnatural. It was sinister. It felt evil. It was stalking me, toying with me, and I believe it would have killed me given the chance. I have never seen nor experienced this feeling again in my life. It's a memory I try to put past me, but I still get nightmares about it. I think until the day I die, I will always have the image burned deep into my memory. The best image I have seen that fits the description of the creature are the werewolves from the movie The Howling. My uncle lives in West Virginia, one of the more remote states in the eastern United States. While his main house is in town, he also has a small cabin up on Spruce Knob where he and my aunt would go during the summer. This cabin is very remote and accessed only by jeep trails and is not connected to an electrical grid. So, my aunt and uncle decided to take advantage of a 3-day weekend sometime in the late 80s and headed out to the cabin for some fly fishing and relaxation in the woods. When they arrived, my aunt went out to sketch some, while my uncle unpacked and built a fire in the fireplace, as it was already getting dark. As night began to fall, my uncle noted how unusually quiet the woods were. He has been camping, canoeing, and backpacking all over the world, and he still says that this is the quietest he has even ever heard them. He and my aunt packed everything up and went to bed late, sometime around midnight. My uncle awoke to a strange thumping and scratching noise coming from outside. He thought it was probably a bear or coyotes trying to get at a dog, and he grabbed his gun to go deal with it. As he pulled the gun out from its case, the door on the outside swung open, and a large hairy shape, vaguely humanoid shape, appeared, silhouetted in the moonlight. He said he never quite got a good look at it, but the one thing he really remembers is the overpowering smell, a stench of decay, and two glowing yellow eyes. He quickly emptied the gun, and while he didn't get a kill shot, he did scratch the beast's arm, which caused it to run squealing into the woods. He and my aunt immediately grabbed their things, got in their Bronco, and hightailed it out of there. Whatever my uncle saw never really bothered them again, and when he returned in the morning, with more people and firepower, he found very little evidence of any intrusion, except for a single strange clawed footprint in front of the cabin, and claw marks on the door. I don't really know whether to believe my uncle or not, as he is known for telling tall tales. However, unlike his other stories, he was completely serious when he told this one, and my aunt even backed him up. This story has always deeply disturbed me, as I too spend a lot of time in the woods. I will be making a trip up to their cabin this summer, so maybe, just maybe, I will see this same strange beast. I live in Washington, and Bigfoot stories are common. Today, my elderly coworker overheard my other coworker and I talking about Bigfoot encounters, and she began to tell us about hers, or at least she thinks it might have been a Bigfoot. Now, I am close to my coworkers, and we tell each other everything about our personal lives, and I have no reason to not believe her. She said she was camping with her husband when she saw a creature across the river from them. She said she also had her dog with her, and it was upset and growling, which was apparently uncommon for this dog. The way she described this creature was that it was about 7 feet tall with scraggly fur all the way down its body. She then went to the trailer to grab their shotgun when her husband also noticed the same creature. They then watched it as it ran through a clearing and disappeared. The thing she said that spooked me a little bit is when she said, "It could have been watching us for days. I don't know, but the dog knew." I was thinking it was a normal Bigfoot story until she described it as scraggly. Could it have been something other than a Bigfoot? Or maybe a dogman? What do you think? So, timeline. This was around 2015. Not quite sure the month, but it was around 11 at night. I was driving from my dad's place to my mom's. I've said this a couple of times now, but my dad has 75 acres of spooky-ass land where most of any of my stories will take place. Anyway, I was driving. I had just started down the long driveway when I felt like I was being watched. Not cool, but it happens more often than you would believe. I'm nearing the highway when I see a dark shape at the edge of the woods. Oh well, probably a deer. I shake it off. We have tons of wildlife in the area, from deer to panthers to the occasional bear. And then it starts chasing me. Keep in mind, please, that this shit is practically normal in my mind. I have tons of weird stuff that happens, and it's not like it was just barreling at me. It just moved after my car, staying at the edge of the woods. So, I keep my pace. I turn onto the highway, and I speed up to about 50 or so. But I keep noticing something in my peripheral, so I slow down and start looking for what it could be. A few yards behind me, I see this huge dog. I grew up with larger dogs. My aunt had a St. Bernard mix growing up, and I've had various other large dogs. This thing was literally the size of my car. I know I mentioned bears before, but bears don't chase cars, and we only ever have black bears, which are like the most docile kind unless threatened, or they have their young around. Okay, so now I'm freaking out. I gun it, releasing a long stream of curses and telling my car to get over it. It was a poorly kept 95 Honda Accord, and I had tons of trouble with it dying on me. So any time I had to push it, I made sure to speak kindly to it, since I didn't care at this point. I was simply trying not to die. I seemingly can't shake it for too long, so in an act of bravery and real stupidity, I pull over in a church parking lot, thinking maybe it's some sort of hell beast and it won't come into the light or onto church land. Holy shit, was I wrong. I stop and get my phone out to call my boyfriend. In that span of time, it catches up and jumps onto my car. I can see and feel and hear the metal popping and creaking, and I see drool splatter onto my windshield. I scream, dropping my phone. It jumps off my car onto the hood, where I get a glimpse of it before it goes into the cemetery and disappears. It was definitely a dog, built like a Rottweiler pit mix, but darker and larger. It was solid black, with paws the size of dinner plates. It had a huge head, almost the size of my car windows. I don't know why it decided to leave me alone, but it did, and I'm thankful. I called my boyfriend, hysterically crying. He calmed me down and listened, and told me that when I got home I should take pictures. And I did, or tried to at least. By the time I got to my mom's, the only thing left was a single dent in the roof of my car, and some faint claw marks that were more like indentations in the metal. Sorry guys, I don't have the pictures anymore. So I guess, if anything, it was either a hellhound or a dogman. You decide. I used to live in Eugene, Oregon, and about 6 years ago, my friend and I saw something unexplainable. We were driving down a country road to a friend's house when I saw something in the middle of the road. It at first appeared to be a large dog. Having grown up with mastiffs, I became worried about the animal. As we got closer, I began to feel a chill down my spine and an uneasiness as it was dusk, but I did not have my car lights on, but could see the animal clearly still. It was the height of a deer with a curved spine and long, thin legs. When it moved, it appears as if the animal's bones were broken, and the movements were so unnatural, but the animal made no cries of pain or appeared to be hurt. The animal had black fur that looked like the worst mange I have ever seen. The naked patches of skin looked wrong, and the bones pushed out from under it. The animal finally turned to look at my car. It had a long nose and was drooling from its open mouth, where there appeared to be large canines. We didn't speak because as it turned to look at us, its eyes were glowing red. I know, it sounds like bullshit from a fake ghost story, but I promise you, this is what they were. This is what I saw. My headlights were not on to illuminate the animal's eyes like that. It crossed slowly in front of my car, and as it disappeared over the side, my passenger yelled to pull up and see what the hell that was. As I pulled up, the animal was gone, and there was only a small drainage pipe and an open field beyond that. We got to our friend's house, and after some prying to him and his parents what we had seen, his father simply chucked and said, "Oh, we see those out here sometimes," and continued to eat dinner. Has anyone else seen something similar to this at close range? If my passenger hadn't been there, I would have thought my imagination got the best of me. I am lucky to know that what I saw was real, and in my opinion, unexplainable. Could it have been a skinwalker? I have no idea. In a small town, rural Tennessee, kids played outside until there was no light to be seen by, and even then, they found ways to stay out until they were brought inside by threat of punishment. I was no exception. One Saturday evening, when I was 2 months into turning 12, as I was coming inside from playing, I was stopped in my tracks by a strange sound. a mix of yipping, growling, and into a barking growl. Coming from an easy 30 or so yards, I was intrigued. I stood on the front porch, looking into the tree line their house faced, trying to find the source of the sound. I expected a dog to emerge, as people were always dumping their dogs in the country, and it was rare that these animals ever found homes. Most of them just roamed the woods. Sitting down on the porch steps, I waited for what I thought would be one of these dogs, but nothing. After a solid 10 minutes, and a loss of more of the dwindling light, I stood to go inside. The sound came again, this time though, deeper and much more guttural. It chilled me. This sound. Looking out into the trees, I saw a very tall figure move in between. It was taller than the fence outlining the trees, and those are a good 4 to 5 feet. I took hold of the door. The sound came again and it felt it go right through me. It's difficult to explain. I felt as if it rooted me to the spot. I opened the door and moved to step inside. My eyes were locked on the spot where this thing had moved toward the fence. I saw a slice of what looked like a shadow coming to life, and put a hand on the fence. I didn't wait for more. I stepped inside the house and closed the door after me. I've never spoken of this to any other person before now. Although I've never doubted what I saw, I never had a name for it. I saw no real features other than a vague outline, but what prompted me to share this were the details of that outline. It had arms of impossible length, and 2 ears on the side of its head that were long and slender. Its upper torso was broad along the shoulders and tapered down. I could not see the legs for the fence, nor the feet. I never heard the term dogman until a month or so ago, and I haven't been 12 for several long years now, but I know that's what I saw out in the tree line. What else could it have been? I saw what I can only describe as a huge, black and hairy thing that ran out in front of my car the other month. My in-laws live way out in the sticks, and I was on my way home. Even just getting into my car, I felt like I was being followed by somebody, and it really put me on edge. As I was getting into my car, I'm pulling out of the driveway, and I start to descend the hill that leads back down the main road in which I need to take. This thing leaps from the woodline and lands in the middle of the road. Immediately upon landing, looks up at my vehicle approaching. The first thing I saw was the unique build this animal had. It was on all fours and its back was arched like a cat, or like a cheetah would be. Its lower part of its body sunk down, much like a hyena even. I guess that's how you want to describe it. For some reason, I wasn't too shocked at what I was looking at. But maybe it's because my brain hadn't quite processed what I was seeing. This thing didn't spend more than a second or two looking at me before it leapt off into the thicker brush on the right side of the road. I have never in my life heard or seen an animal like what I saw. I do remember it was dark red in certain spots and had interesting streaks on its fur, but its face and part of its chest was black. I remember it had really long arms and legs. They were lanky and it seemed to have a really weird body formation. Like its legs and arms and head were too big and disproportionate. It was a strange sight to behold. Even its head was pretty disproportionate to the rest of its body, just in size. I would imagine the neck muscles needed to support a skull that large. Just in the position that it was in, much like some of the big cats you see, the ripples of the muscle underneath the fur. Especially with my headlights illuminating this thing head on, you can tell this thing was built for strength and speed. If you need a better depiction, think of a horse. Their muscle ripples are pretty clearly defined under their fur coat. It was like that, and then imagine shining a light on that. It was frightening. I want to stress to you just how big this animal was. I mean, it was easily the size of a horse, but it clearly was not a dog, nor a horse. Dogs don't arch their backs like that, and not even Great Danes get that large. Maybe this thing was going after some deer, or trying to get some food, but it seemed like it was on a mission to get somewhere, and I just happened to come up in it in the road where it landed. It didn't seem too bothered by me though. It never bared its teeth, or acted in any way. I think it just stared at my oncoming headlights, and then bolted. I was the only one on the road at the time, so I'm pretty sure nobody else thought that than me. To be honest with you though, I have no idea what I saw. I don't know what kind of animal looks like that. I haven't really told anyone because they would just tell me I was either hallucinating or what, but I swear I'm not making this up. This did indeed happen to me. I'm writing into you because I wanted to know if maybe you could tell me what kind of creature is stalking my trailer at night. Based on listening to your content and reading a little bit about it on Reddit and the internet, it seems like I might have a dogman in my neighborhood. Let me just say that for those who are looking for this creature, don't. If it finds you, I would deem you unlucky. I never asked for this thing to happen, and I wish I would have never had run-ins with this thing. I'm awake pretty late most nights since I suffer from chronic pain in my wrists and ankles, and I'm just an all-around night owl anyway. I live in a small single-wide trailer by myself. The area in which I live is fairly open with some woods here and there and canals not too far away. What I experience is several different things. Before I ever saw it, I just heard it banging on my trailer and making noise. Sometimes it would sound like it would charge into my trailer and bang as loud as it could. It's left noticeable dents on the siding of my house, as well as claw marks and other weird markings. The claw marks weren't deep though. It was as if this animal was trying to just leave markings or something. That's the way I at least interpreted it. I remember one night I was doing dishes and looked outside my kitchen window to see this thing climbing out of the brush and was heading right towards my house. It was like I was watching a horror movie unfold before my very eyes. My jaw and eyes opened in horror, and I remember I slammed the plate down that I was washing, promptly breaking it. I ran to all my doors and windows and locked them and turned off all my lights. I hid in the corner and listened. I remember hearing this thing pace slowly around my trailer for the next 45 minutes, give or take. It never made a noise, but sometimes you would hear a tapping along the walls, pushing up against the trailer, and then it would go silent. Then you would hear it pace around the house again, slowly. After maybe an hour, in total, it stopped, and I did not get the courage to get up and look out the window for at least another hour or two, just to see if it was gone. The whole time I remember sitting there, not even knowing what to do. Should I call the police? Would they even be able to help me? Would they even want to help me? This happened to me about 4 p.m. in the evening, so it was broad daylight at the time. This thing is much more active at night. Part of me almost wonders if it's because it can't really be seen then. I keep blinds and curtains over all my windows. I don't even want to risk seeing this thing looking in. I will often worry that this thing is looking for a weak spot to break into my home, just so it can get me. I was 12 years old when this happened to me, and I remember it very vividly. I had woken up in the middle of the night to go and get some water, and I did. Then I think I had to use the bathroom. Afterwards, I crawled back into bed, but couldn't quite get comfortable, and began tossing and turning a bunch. The motion light detector turned on outside my window. My bedroom is near where the front door is, so when the motion light detector goes off, I can clearly see if somebody is standing outside of our door from where I'm laying in bed. It's bright enough that even with my eyes closed, I saw there was a change in lighting. Out of my reflexes, I opened my eyes and looked, and pressing its face against the glass was the ugliest dog I've ever seen. After a second or two, of staring in horror at this animal. It began dragging its face left and right, smearing saliva and mucus against the glass, while never breaking its eye contact with me. I remember it having huge pointed ears and a longer snout. It reminded me a lot of a German Shepherd, to be honest. It was much uglier than a German Shepherd, though. My aunt used to have a German Shepherd, and I loved that dog. As it was dragging its face against the glass, I was screaming and wasn't sure what to do. It's like it was smirking at me. It's like it got entertainment from my total terror and fear that this thing was staring into me. I've never been stared at so intently by anyone or anything before. It was wicked. Next thing I know, I'm running out of my bedroom, and I must have been so enveloped in fear that I don't even remember jumping up out of bed. Only ever thought that one time, and it's not like we live anywhere crazy. We're in a typical little neighborhood. I don't even think there's any forest or woods anywhere around where we live. My father is a pastor, and after telling him what I saw, pleaded the blood of Jesus and prayed over me and the house. I don't know if that did anything, but like I said, I never saw this thing after that happened. After I ran out of my bedroom and into my parents' room and telling them about what happened, they never went and checked outside my bedroom. I don't know if it's that they believe me or what, but they did not dismiss what I saw, only comforted me in my fearful state. I guess I should be thankful that I have such understanding and believing parents. I know most people would write off their child immediately and tell them to go back to bed. It probably helped out that I was 12 years old versus being a little kid and telling them about what I saw. I live out near the Arkansas River and have already had run-ins with what I would believe to be the Dogman. For those of you that don't know, this is what's described as a large black dog that will get you killed if you're not careful. At least that's what I believe. In fact, I have to keep my animals in at night for fear that they will be slaughtered. I used to have 4 dogs, but one of them was killed recently by what I believe to be this animal. He was a bloodhound and I loved him very much. We called him Brave, and I had gotten him since he was just a puppy. One evening, as I was getting home from work, I saw him lying in my back field, beaten and bloody. When I ran over to him, he was covered in blood from head to toe, and had deep 6-inch lacerations all over his body. The lacerations were in patterns of 4 and 5, like he was clawed violently by some large animal. It looks like one of the lacerations nicked his artery in his neck, because he was bleeding out and was almost gone by the time I had got to him. His eyes were already glazed over. Well, at least one, because his left eye was missing, and it looks like he was pretty swollen with a couple of bones broken. I began sobbing uncontrollably as I lost him in my arms. I had no idea what did this to him. My first thought was bear, but I haven't seen a bear around here at all, and bears don't do this that I know of. It wasn't long after that I began to find other mutilated animals around where I live. Deer were pretty common to find ripped up, but sometimes you would see raccoons, possums, and even skunks sometimes, just shredded into ribbons. I have no idea what animal goes out here and kills small animals and just leaves them. It's like these animals are just being killed for the sake of killing. Just recently, I began hearing a bunch of screaming up by the river at about 9 at night. It didn't sound like a human screaming. It sounded like an animal of some kind. I was too cautious and scared to even risk going out and seeing what it was. The way my property sits is if you exit the back screen door and you walk out a ways, I would say 200 yards, the land will start to go downhill to a creek. The screaming sounded like it was coming from the creek. Whatever was making it had to have been large because it was so loud. Instinctively, I wanted to say mountain lion because the only rational explanation that would pop in my mind, but it didn't quite sound like a mountain lion. I won't even dare step foot any further than I need to where I live without carrying a high caliber rifle, just to be safe. I've seen this critter a few times before, and I don't trust it more than I trust lawyers. This thing has been terrorizing me for long enough, and I will not hesitate to put a bullet into this thing. For those of you who have dealt with similar experiences, I'm sure you'll agree that this thing is easier to hear than it is to see. I've only ever seen it a handful of times, but I hear it way more often than I would want to. It's almost as if it wants me to know it's in the area, but doesn't want me to see it. So therefore it goes around and leaves mutilated dead animals for me to run into and find, which I've been reading up on, and I guess that's more of a common occurrence with these dogmen than you'd want to believe. Dead cats, dead dogs, skunks, possums, you name it. Mutilated, ripped up. It's like I'm living in a horror movie. Back in 2011, when I went to go hike with a friend in Colorado in the winter, I experienced a creature that was dark black, easily was about 8 feet tall, and looked like a massive wolf. We're out hiking at the base of one of the mountains around where he lives, and everything was blanketed in snow. We had been hiking for a couple of miles when my friend stops me and pointed off in the distance about 65 yards away, where him and I both saw what looked to be a huge wolf standing up, watching us from the tree line. It responded immediately to us looking at it, as if it didn't want us to see it. It began growling menacingly. The amount of force this animal had from a growl alone was immense. My friend and I could feel the vibrations through our body, and it was at least 65 yards away, like I said. This thing looked angry that we noticed it and began to show more and more aggressive behavior, but it hadn't yet made a move to come to us. Neither my friend nor I had any weapons on us, which, in hindsight, was really dumb on our part. We were curious, but we were also terrified, and I think at this point we had more than enough of what we needed to, and so we turned around and we fled. We were both honestly surprised this thing didn't try and follow us to eat us. I remember I asked him, "I didn't think timber wolves got that big." And he said to me, "I didn't think they stood on 2 legs either." I wanted to tell you about something that I saw recently on my morning commute to work. I was taking the road to where my job is that leads me a little bit out of town where I work, and I see this weird-looking dog clear the road in one jump and landed on top of a pile of rocks across the road. It was crazy to watch, and I remember saying to myself, "What is that?" I know I didn't hallucinate it because the sun had just come up, and it was light enough outside, and you could clearly make out a large dog that jumped far enough to clear the road. After it landed on the rocks, it ran down to them to where you couldn't see where it went. I didn't really get any other details because it happened so fast. I want to keep telling myself it was just a really big dog, but I don't know any dog that gets as big as what I saw. Back about 20 years ago, when I was visiting Kentucky, because that's where my dad used to live, I saw something that most people believe doesn't exist. I call it a werewolf. I've heard other names for it, but I really don't know what else to name it. Back in 2001, I was trying to find my dad's house for the first time since he moved there, and I was using a map to try and find out what road to take. I can't remember what 2-lane highway I was using, but I remember turning off into a pullout to park my car and study the map to get a better look. As I'm looking down at the map, trying to find the right road to take, I get this overwhelming sensation that somebody is looking at me. I look up and look to my left onto the road, and there's nobody. No cars, nothing. Then, I look to my right, and standing not even 10 feet away from my vehicle is a living werewolf in the flesh, or at least that's how I would describe it. This thing had to be 9 to 10 feet tall easily, and was more solid than somebody who bench presses 200 pounds. This thing was a behemoth, with the head that resembled someone of a Doberman Pinscher, with sharp pointed ears and a wider, shorter snout. This thing was covered in jet black hair, but not long and shaggy like. It was more short and coarse. and I could vividly remember seeing the muscles rippling through its fur. It was glaring at me, looking me right into the eyes menacingly. It seemed pissed off that I pulled into that pullout and saw it. I don't know if I encroached on its territory or what I did, but I got the strong feeling that it did not want me around. I'm staring at this animal in total shock. It's like I was in some sort of trance looking into its evil, glowing eyes. After what felt like 10 seconds, I was able to snap out of it. I threw my car into drive and I whipped out of there fast. I was probably doing around 65 to 70 miles per hour when that highway is only 45. Hi. I know this isn't too much of an encounter, but I live in eastern Texas, and one night I was driving. I saw the largest timber wolf I've ever seen step up to the road and clear the entire thing in one leap. This wolf was easily the size of a horse and gray in color. I don't really remember too many other details because I was coming around a bend in the road, and I just seen this large dog step up to the road. Then I realized its size, and then, well, it leaped over 6 feet in the air and cleared the road. It all happened so fast, but doggone it, it scared the living daylights out of me. I run a small taco truck outside of town. We're actually set up in an old, what used to be Kmart parking lot. Lately, I've been having to dish out a lot of my profits in repair due to the huge dents and scratches that keep appearing on my taco truck at night. Luckily, we've moved, so since then we haven't had to deal with it, but the damages, well, they take a little bit longer to take care of. We close down at about 8 p.m. and I have my small 2-man crew clean up and then head home by 8:30. For a while, I didn't have any surveillance equipment whatsoever and began noticing deep scratch marks in my truck. This would happen more often than not, but I don't want to say it was every night. Other times, we would show up in the morning and there would be huge dents on the side of my vehicle. Since we're on the outskirts of town, there's not a whole lot of other things in the area, but we're able to get a decent amount of foot traffic due to the strip mall that's close by. But behind us is just an undeveloped plot of land with wilderness beyond that. My initial impression is that we're attracting critters because my employees aren't properly disposing of daily waste and food products. Once I bought and installed the surveillance system, I quickly learned that to be false. What I saw on the surveillance scares me and baffles me still. When I would watch the tapes back, I would see this canine figure approach the truck and attack it. This thing would walk around the truck weirdly and sporadically attack like it was an animal itself, clawing and biting. There would be other moments where you could see this thing charge the truck from off camera and slam into it, moving and rocking the entire vehicle. I remember watching it for the first time thinking, what the hell? I even had some of my employees watch it with me, just to make sure I wasn't crazy and that I was not the only one seeing this thing. I don't know what the hell this is, or what kind of animal is attacking my truck, but it cost me a lot of money, and I ended up having to move my truck far, far away from there. I don't know how much I could stress to you that this animal was big, and it was walking on 2 legs. I don't know what kind of animal walks around on 2 legs, but this one did. Where our new location is, I haven't had any issues so far, but I have a nice 12-gauge shotgun ready to use in case this thing decides to attack my truck ever again. I have cousins that live in Montana. They've just recently found out some interesting information about the land that they live on. This information has helped them understand the reasons why things are happening where they live. Let me elaborate. For years now, since moving in where they have, they've been experiencing some kind of bizarre animal on their property. They've described it as having a long dog snout, covered in fur, and lean and muscular looking. They haven't shared with me too many other details, like if it's trying to get into their house, or has been wanting to hurt anybody. Nothing like that. My cousin told me that it hangs around just a little too much, and she is a very firm believer in the paranormal and cryptids. She firmly believes that it is a dogman. She's the one that started doing heavy homework on the subject and found out that the whole area in which their house used to be built was an Indian burial ground many years ago, long before there was any residential development in the area. From what she gathered is that her neighbors aren't experiencing the same thing. It's just them on their plot of land. This is just my own curiosity, but I almost wonder if it might have anything to do with their beliefs. They are Eckankar followers. I have no idea if that adds any extra spiritual pull for the dogmen to show up on the land, or if they're just protecting what the natives used to have there long ago. This encounter happened back in the early 1970s, as told by my father. This took place in Northern California, perpendicular to a larger river. I can't exactly remember the name in the river in which he told me about because he passed away not long ago, and I just want to get his story out there and heard. He was a pretty young man at the time of his encounter. I want to say maybe 17 at most. My father was going down to the river to skip some rocks or do something like that, when close by him, in thick brush, popped out a dog head with glowing red eyes and dark gray fur, as my father described it. It scared him, so he ran away and never went back to that river, as far as I know. That used to be a hot spot for him and his friends to go hang out, but he tells me that his other friends whom he hung out with had told him that they too had been seeing the same monster. Before my father died, he did do some looking into on the area and its history. He found out that there had been a lot of black magic and occultism practice in and around that forest area, taking place in the same area as well years back. He told me he had no idea if there was any correlation to that and what he had saw, but doesn't necessarily write it off that what he saw was a demon or something. He just wasn't convinced it was a living animal and something that had come from out of hell.